What's the creepiest thing you've seen in broad daylight? Not quite broad daylight, but more like dusk. I look out my front window and see a lump on my lawn that looks out of place. I think, that really looks like a dude in a ghillie suit on my front lawn. I keep staring at it and become more and more convinced it is a dude in a ghillie suit. And I start to freak out a bit and don't know what I am supposed to do in this situation. Like, do I call the cops? Then a bunch of neighborhood kids run up to the lump and the actual factual real dude in a ghillie suit gets up. It was an older kid or a dad or something playing hide and seek in a ghillie suit. Was taking the subway one day, a lady was walking around shoving a massive bottle of hot sauce. Bloodshot eyes, tears streaming down her face. Of course she sat next to me on the two-seat bench. At first, she was complimenting my nails, and then she just started staring at me, much too close for comfort. She still had tears down her face, still chugging the hot sauce. I made a comment asking if it was good or something. She acted like I was crazy for noticing it. This was at least 2 years ago, and I still can't get her face out of my mind. Hope she's doing well. I watched a murder of crows follow a Toyota Corolla into a mall parking lot. The car parked, and a greasy-looking middle-aged man got out. He beelined for the mall entrance, without once making eye contact with the crows who were now following him. At the last second before entering the mall, he tossed a big handful of peanuts over his shoulder, and the crows went wild. It seemed less like the man was controlling the crows, and more like the crows were controlling him. The creepiest thing for me was when I was out surfing in Northern California. It's really cold, dark water, and I was out by myself. I was sitting there waiting for a wave and my leash felt like it was caught up, which it does sometimes. I like to fix it before a wave comes so there's no hindrance when I go to stand up. Well, I'd pull at it a little, and it feels like seaweed or something's on it. I turn towards the back of my board, and there is something on it. A harbor seal, who's sitting on the back of my board laying on my leash. Scared the fuck out of me, but me screaming scared the fuck out of him, and it went back into the water and I paddled in. I know it's not the creepiest thing in this thread, but it definitely scared me pretty good. When I was about 8 years old, I was walking down the sidewalk in Toronto, when 3 young long-haired guys in their late teens or early 20s ran past us laughing and fooling around. I didn't think of it at the time being a child, but it appeared they might have been drunk. Just after they passed by, I heard a loud screeching of brakes and a thud. I turned to see one of the men sliding down the road on his face. He flew about 20 yards before hitting the ground. A Harley rider almost ran over him and crashed his bike, avoiding the man. They approached him. He wasn't moving at all. The Harley rider took one quick look at him and took off his t-shirt and covered his head. From whatever he saw, he could clearly see the man was gone. His 2 other friends were just staring in stunned shock, not saying a word. It was 1970. Driving down the 5 in California, I saw a car drift across the center divide. It's a massive highway in the middle of nowhere, with a big grass divide, maybe the equivalent of 3 to 4 lanes wide, and directly into a semi-truck going the other way. I was probably 2 to 3 cars behind the drifting car. Neither vehicle had hardly any chance to brake. It happened over the course of maybe 2 seconds. It literally exploded into pulverized dust. No flames or fire, just a massive explosion of glass, metal, paint, and presumably the occupants. The semi shuddered horribly, but with its massive inertia, it seemed to lose very little forward momentum. Happened so fast we were past it in seconds. The poor person must have fallen asleep at the wheel or something. I work security at a hospital. I ought to just sit outside of the construction zone where they're doing remodeling and make sure homeless people and teenagers don't get in. But I also sat right outside the door they used to take the bodies out. There's just something eerie about how discreet and impersonal it is. Not that I expect there to be some sort of fanfare when someone dies, but they're just wrapped in quilts or thick blankets, quietly loaded up into an unmarked van, and that's it. It's a major hospital, so there's several bodies wheeled out every day. Worst is when you know it's a child, but I thankfully don't see much of that. They tend to wait until the middle of the night so less people see, so they don't upset people. Always just strikes this weird feeling in me when I see them. Late 70s, I was in about 3rd grade. Myself and 2 buddies were walking towards the crosswalk, having just gotten out of school. A car came out of nowhere and plowed through the crosswalk. There were 2 crossing guards and at least 2 other kids on the crosswalk. The 2 kids that I remember were girls, a year younger than me. I knew one. The crossing guards made it out okay, and the girl I knew got thrown to the side, ended up thumping the back of her head on the curb. A little blood from that, but she was otherwise okay and conscious. The other girl, wow, I mean, this happened right in front of the 3 of us, about 15 feet away. I remember seeing the other girl lying face down in a big puddle of her own blood. The car had knocked off her shoes and her skirt, not the underwear, at least. She looked like she had, well, slid for a short distance on her face when she made contact with the pavement. And then she came around. I will never forget that. Couldn't make out her face for the blood, couldn't even tell how bad it was because there was so much blood. She was sobbing and calling out for her mommy. You could tell she was scared and didn't really know what had happened to her. The car never stopped, just kept on going after blowing through a school zone and an occupied crosswalk at about 40 miles per hour. An adult arrived with the ambulance and the police, probably a detective, asked the three of us what we saw. We walked to our respective homes afterwards, talking about the whole thing excitedly. Being a latchkey kid, I came home to an empty house, called my mom at work to tell her what had just happened and just broke. Completely fell to pieces on the phone as the reality hit me. I've never forgotten that incident or the girls, the images, their voices, still see it as clear as day. But I haven't talked about it in decades. On the bright side, the girls recovered. One with just a bump on the back of the head, the other in the hospital. Our principal went to visit her there, brought her the cards we all made in class. Reported back to us on her condition, but I never knew her name, and I don't remember ever seeing her after that day. They caught up with the driver a few miles down the road. He was drunk. Driving down a small rural road in the middle of nowhere, Arizona, probably just a few miles north of the border. Past a man walking, clearly Mexican, and clearly had just come a long way. He shouted agua as we passed, so we pulled about 200 feet in front of him, dropped off the only carton of water we had, and kept driving. As we got back on the road and looked behind us, a whole family was with the man now running towards the water. I guess they were walking in the brush next to the road. Maybe not creepy, but I think about it a lot. I'm from Appalachia, so all the signs in the Southwest saying not to pull over to assist people on the road made sense to me back then. I hope they got where they were headed. We used to take an old back road that would take us to town where I lived a while ago. It was a 20 to 30-minute drive. It was an old stretch of road that was an old worn road that went through a stretch of trees, a small burst of houses surrounded by farmland and fields, so it was a very rural area. There is a train track that cuts through, and an unkept road that goes off to the side on the right. One evening we went down the road, there was a car, I want to say an old Honda, I couldn't tell, that was parked off on that little road to the side. I saw them and thought odd, because the road lead to nowhere, it just stopped a few feet away. We came back much later in the day, night had fallen and the car was still sat there. A few days later we find that the car had been linked to a murder. Apparently the car belonged to a woman who had been missing. Her boyfriend beat her and left her in a shallow grave. The car he abandoned and left there while her child was at school. Her name was Nisha Nelson. I saw an old man die while eating in a restaurant in Lax while waiting for my flight. He was sitting alone at a table and just collapsed. EMTs came and did CPR, etc., to no avail and carted him off covered with a sheet. This was the middle of a weekday. People everywhere. I had a similar experience. It was a gorgeous summer evening, but technically still daylight, because I live in Sweden and the sun really only sets for a couple of hours in the summers. And I was working as volunteer staff at my tiny village's yearly summer concert. The outdoor venue was packed. I was taking a break from directing people to the porta potties, and I was chowing down on a hamburger. Suddenly, a man in his 60s or so falls. The one he falls on it happens to be an off-duty EMT, and she immediately takes action, and within less than a minute, she's starting chest compressions. An ambulance was called at once, but our village is the kind where some houses and barns still have moss roofs, so the nearest ambulance would take an hour to arrive. I borrowed a blanket from another concert-goer and ended up holding that blanket with one arm to shield the man from gawking crowds and held his sobbing wife with the other arm for over 2 hours. The couple were on vacation from Germany, didn't speak a lick of Swedish. They had just wanted a lovely night filled with music, and instead the wife was now starting her first day as a widow as the clock ticked past midnight. I think I slept for 3 hours or so before getting up early the next day to surprise my best friend with her bachelorette party. It almost felt wrong that life just went on without this man ever getting a say in it. One day I held a widow in my arms, and the literal next day I held a bride-to-be. I used to own a horse boarding and training barn in Landry, SC. In the back of my back pasture was a gate that led to the neighboring property, and the old man who I rented the stables from said it was fine for us to ride on the other property, which he used to own. The other property was huge but super weird in that it had a chain link fence all around it, at least on the roadsides, which was probably at least 3/4 mile of chain link fence, which anyone who's familiar with rural areas knows is just plain not done. Other than that, it seemed normal, mostly empty. No farming or cows or anything, just a huge chain link fence land. So one day, I took a student on a trail ride, on horseback of course, and decided we'd go onto the other property. It actually had pretty well-maintained trails, for four-wheeling I reckon, that went through the woods at the back of the property. I had this bad feeling the further we went, like we shouldn't be there, or I also get that feeling when a horse is getting keyed up. Eventually, I started to hear this faint diesel engine sound that I at first thought was a four-wheeler in the distance, but as we got closer, I could tell it was a cat digging and reversing and dumping dirt. By hand to God, a voice in my head that wasn't my own said, "Turn back." So I told my student we were heading back, and we did. And that was that. Months later, the Todd Colehep serial killer story broke. His latest murder had been a girl and boyfriend he lured onto his property. He shot the boyfriend and kept the girlfriend chained in a shipping container for months, where he beat and raped her and walked her on a leash like a dog. That was his property we were riding on. From the timeline, the girlfriend was currently chained up, and what we'd heard was him burying the boyfriend's body in the woods on the back of his property, away from the road, and we almost rode right up on top of him in the middle of doing it. I'd also stole his trash can once. But late to the party, so doubt anyone will see this. But by far the creepiest thing I've ever seen wasn't anything supernatural, but just the ugly truth about how selfish and uncaring people truly are. This incident broke me in a way none of the other life-threatening incidents and deaths I've dealt with ever could. I was going home from a late Friday night shift, about midnight, on a super well-lit busy station on one of the most populated commuter lines in England. Quite a few people around. The train comes up and stops. Right in front of me are the doors, and a guy is leaning against them. He was bald and in an expensive suit. Looked like he was probably a middle-aged London businessman who had stayed in London for a few after work. While he'd fallen asleep or passed out leaning against the doors open and he falls backwards. I sidestep out of instinct. He was quite tall, and the train doors are about a foot above the platform, so his head must have fallen about 7 or 8 foot before it thudded into the concrete platform with a wet thud. I'll never forget the look of shock as we made eye contact for a brief second as he fell past me, confused and scared like someone who's just woken up from a bad dream. Then spult, gone. I'm still in my work mindset, pub bouncer, so immediately rushed to try and offer first aid. He's out cold but still breathing. His feet are still in the doors. The doors are closing on his feet over and over. I'm trying to talk to him and wake him up, but nothing's happening. Blood is slowly trickling out his ears. I've been in other situations like this. I know what that means. The commuters getting off the train are stepping over him and walking off to the taxi rank. The commuters left on the train are drunk. They're laughing at him. My phone is dead. I can't call an ambulance. Nobody around me cares, or at least any more than to laugh at a dying man and mock him. I'm knelt by him, screaming for help or a mobile phone. More commuters walk past, just staring at us. The conductor of the train comes to see what's stopping the doors. I tell him to call an ambulance. He refuses, says it's not policy or some shit. I can barely believe what I'm hearing. The conductor tells me to move his feet out of the door so the train can keep going. I scream that the man's got a neck and back injury, and if the conductor moves him, I'll break his nose, then testify against him when the police inquiry into the commuter's death happens. He scoffs at me and says the company gets fined £1,000 a minute if they're late, and hurries back down the train to radio his control room what to do. To this day, I hope he fucking gets cancer, the useless cunt. Eventually, some Pierce Brosnan-looking commuter stops and gives me his phone. I call 999 and get an ambulance en route. The drunk ones on the train are all staring and looking, laughing and telling stupid jokes, harassing me that they're late now and to just move him off the train so they can go home. I'm getting properly heckled and abused verbally by the train goers on one side. The guy who gave me his phone has stepped well away. The guy on the floor's breathing is becoming more and more shallow. There's more and more blood coming from his head. I'm trying to relate everything to the ambulance operator. I hear the sirens down the road over all the noise from the train. More screaming and heckling. The operator is saying something, and it all goes quiet like it was faded out in a movie, and I hear this guy take his last breath. 2 seconds. 3, 4. Not breathing. I start chest compressions and feel tears running down my cheeks. Suddenly, I'm pushed out the way by a paramedic, and they get an oxygen mask and one of those hand pump things on him. I try to explain the situation, but they grab him within a minute of arriving and are wheeling him off. I hand the guy his phone back and he looks white as a sheet. The cuffs of my white shirt are dark red. The train conductor comes back having watched all this from about 5 cars down the platform, doing his best not to get involved, and takes the safety lock off the open doors. I step on the train and nobody in the carriage will say anything or make eye contact with me. It's silent for the next 3 stops. I get off and walk down the platform. The conductor won't make eye contact with me. I never found out if they managed to resuscitate the guy. I'd wager money against it though. Stopped working security after that, went through some PTSD counseling for that and a few other life-altering /ending incidents I was first responder to. Never fully got my faith in the goodness of humanity back. Such a senseless, stupid way to go. Out of maybe 150 people who saw it, I was the only one to do anything, and maybe the guy who gave me his phone. Still fucking detest London commuter types. When I was 15 or 16, I was homeschooled and took my classes online. So I was home alone most days until people got back in the evenings. One morning I went on a run, and I got this feeling like I was being watched when I got into our neighborhood, so I was a little on edge and went back into my house ASAP. A few hours later, after working on a paper, I went downstairs to get a snack and noticed that one of the bushes in the forest on the other side of our backyard fence, we lived in a rural town, suddenly shook around a lot. We had a lot of bobcats, coyotes, etc. in the area, so I wrote it off as one of those at first, but when I got back upstairs, I looked down at the spot from my bedroom window and saw the top of a man's head. I almost again wrote it off as some sort of animal, until I noticed some skin and what appeared to be a jacket collar, and I immediately freaked out and went to get the phone to call my mom. The creepy thing was that since I got back from my run, I went outside to use our hot tub, and because we didn't have people directly behind our house, I didn't close the blinds when I changed. Whoever the dude was, he was probably there watching the whole time, and I was just really creeped out at the thought of that. My mom did some asking around, and while no one else said they ever saw anyone creeping around the woods around that time, someone did say there was a strange man in the area who was sometimes seen talking to teenage boys coming home from school, and would often make them feel uncomfortable. We lived near the high school. After this, I always kept my blinds closed, rarely used the hot tub if there wasn't a neighbor outside, and looked over my shoulder a little more when I went on runs. When I lived in Madison, Wisconsin, I lived across the street from Camp Randall, the football stadium. On game days, they'd shut our street down and people would flood it, drinking and partying. We'd sit on our porch and drink beers and Bloody Marys with the crowd at 9 in the morning. Good times. But one day, there was this girl walking briskly up the sidewalk, sobbing, makeup smeared all over her face. She was covered in dirt, like she'd been rolling around in it, head to toe. She didn't look beaten or anything that might have suggested a brawl, just covered in dirt, not mud. It was not a wet day. And the thing was, she was dressed for game day, all decked out in her Bucky Badger stuff, and she had her hair up in little buns. Whatever happened to her had just happened, and given that she was, despite her condition, a very attractive girl, our minds went to the worst place, that she had been sexually assaulted. I lived in a big house with 7 guys and a girl. At the time, it was just the guys on the porch, and given what we feared might have happened, we called for our female roommate to see if the girl needed help. The girl just shook her head, said I'm fine, and kept walking. It's not as creepy as some, but still, given the situation, the side of the girl, it's hard to think she wasn't raped. I still think of her when I think of my time at that house. When I was working at McDonald's in high school, I was getting ready to pull into the parking lot for my shift, and there was a lot of snow on the ground. This older lady, who's probably late 60s, early 70s, gets out of her Ford Taurus in a dress. She then proceeds to grab one of the door handles of McDonald's, hike up her dress and shit right by the door. She pulled her underwear off and left them right there for back into her car and left. I was watching this all from my truck and was gagging. I proceed to walk in to clock in, and my manager asks why I'm late. I told them what happened and to pull up the cameras. One of the managers threw up in the office and the other told me to grab a bucket and mop to clean it. It took 3 buckets of mop water and soap to clean it. Then I quit right after. All of this was at like 2 p.m. on a Saturday. I went to school in a rough part of town with a large homeless population. One day I was walking to the bus stop and the police had shown up. Poor guy had died of hypothermia right there in the streets, curled up in a ball outside the front of shop. Less disturbing and more heartbreaking. If you have money to spare, please go to a secondhand or dollar store. Buy hats, mittens, scarves, keep them with you in the car, and if you see somebody without proper winter gear, help them out. You don't have to spend a lot of money to help the homeless. Even the bare necessities could save a life.